Great.
All right. People are streaming in. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in about a minute or two. We just want to wait for everyone to get into our Zoom.
How do I get to see everyone here?
Really? All right, we'll just give it another minute and then we'll start soon. All right, so it looks like we got quite a few people in, so I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the virtual book launch for Whose Right Is It? The Second Amendment and the Fight Over Guns by Hana Bajramovic, who we have right up in the corner. So Hana, your little bio, she lives right here in Brooklyn and has an English degree from Harvard University and JD from Yale Law School. She has also worked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and at New York litigation firm. She now currently works to protect reproductive rights and access to reproduction health care, and Whose Right Is It is her first book. So a big congratulations for your debut book. And also with us, we have Judge Raymond J. Lohier Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. A little background. Judge Raymond J. Lohier is a Second Circuit judge and received the NYU Alumni Association's Eugene J. Keough Award for Distinguished Public Service, and he used to work in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice and as an Assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York, and he's proud to call Hana his law clerk. So we have quite the duo here today. I'm very excited to begin, but right before, I just wanted to read our anti-harassment policy. So we expect all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates the standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may be immediately removed from the event, but we're all going to be well behaved. So without further ado, I will hand the screen over to you two. All right.
Thank you very much, Brittany. And I must tell everybody who's joined us how I'm totally, completely thrilled to be able to host this book party. Hana and I had the great fortune of meeting Hana about 5 years ago, Hana, I think, when I interviewed you for this job in my chambers, in my office. And I knew actually from that moment on that you were going to write something. And you're going to write something really spectacular. My intuition has come to fruition with this really terrific book that I urge everyone, if you haven't already, to read. And we'll get into the audience for the book in a moment, but I do think it's timely and an important contribution to this discussion about the Second Amendment. The other thing that I have to say is that I also promised at a certain point, Hana, that I would host a book party for her. And this was about 2.5 years ago, I think. if you had told me, as I said a little bit ago, that the book party would be in the middle of a pandemic and that I would be using Zoom, my first question would be, what is Zoom? And second, I would ask, well, what do you mean a pandemic? But here we are, and it's sort of a remarkable testament to Hana and all of the people who have contributed to the completion of this book, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a second, that you were able to get it done in very difficult times, and so congratulations. I want to talk to you at the very beginning about the acknowledgments at the very end of the book. So tell me a little bit about some of the people in the acknowledgments. I know that I believe that your parents are watching this, Rudy and Sania, I'm sorry. And the book is also dedicated to Elisa. So tell me about those three people a little bit.
Yes, so those are my parents and my sister, Elisa, who are all on the call, I think. And I wanted to dedicate it to Elisa, who I'm going to embarrass here. Sorry. She's my younger sister. She's 5 years younger than me. She lives in Seattle now, and we don't, live in the same city, but every time we talk, we're, best friends. She's like the kindest, most thoughtful person I know, and I love her very much. And so this book is dedicated to her. And my parents, obviously, make it into the acknowledgments too, right. Because they, have supported every choice I've made, including this book.
Well, Rudy and Sania ought to be extremely proud, as I am, of this terrific accomplishment. You also, Hana, acknowledge some people who I think had a direct role in helping you put this book together. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think they're on too. Christian Trimmer and Mark Podesta, my editors, and Wendy Gu, my agent and my friend since high school, speech and debate, all had, an enormous hand in writing and editing and working on this book. It's crazy to me that my name is the only name on the cover. It feels like they should be listed as co-authors. They did just such amazing work shaping it and turning it into the book it is. So thank you all.
So if I recall correctly, you came up with this idea for the book while you were actually clerking, I think, in these chambers. I take no responsibility for that. That was really entirely your idea. I thought it was brilliant when I heard about it. And I wonder, how did you come up with the idea for the book?
Yeah, so it's also, on Wendy and Christian too. I think we all listened to an episode of More Perfect, the podcast, that was about the history of the Second Amendment. And I think we each independently were like, wow, this is a crazy story. I had no idea this was the history of the amendment, and talked about how it would be really important to tell that story to a younger audience who, the existing literature isn't targeted at, and who are, facing gun violence daily and the stresses of gun violence. And I guess if you want to sort of get into the what made that podcast so surprising and interesting, I think there are two things. I think the first more general thing is just how new our current conception of the Second Amendment is. Mm-hmm. We see it today as an individual right enshrined in the Constitution, but it wasn't always that way. And indeed, for most of American history, it wasn't viewed that way at all. The amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We all know that second half, but that first half gets cut out. But for most of American history, everybody thought it was about the militia, the first half. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until starting, in the 60s and 70s that started to change. And it wasn't enshrined in the Constitution until 2008 with the case of DC v. Heller.
So, and you mentioned, I think, your friend Wendy's role in this, your agent, Wendy's role in this. But why gear it towards a younger readership of 10 to 14-year-olds? How did that come up?
Yeah, so young people, 10 to 14-year-olds, are directly affected by the gun violence problem. They deal with it every day in schools. They carry clear backpacks. They walk through metal detectors. They deal with school shooter drills. There's a story of, I think it was in Indiana at an elementary school recently. In a school shooter drill, they used pellet guns to simulate shootings, and the teachers were left with bloody welts. So there's a trauma that comes with just the preparing for violence, if not violence itself. And so it's a problem a lot of young people face, but don't have literature targeted at them. And so we meant to fill that gap.
And of course, you start, I think, very powerfully with the shooting in Parkland in 2018, just to follow up on what you're saying. I've got to tell you, and I've said this to you before in reading this book and thinking about what you say, and for those of you who don't have it, there are a lot of different graphs, and it's just really a wonderful, illustrative book with a lot of illustrations, graphs. It seems to me that a lot of adults would benefit from reading this book.
Yeah.
So it's not just targeted, as I understand it, to 10 to 14-year-olds. And I understand that that's the main target, but a lot of adults could clearly benefit today from understanding the Second Amendment and the history of the Second Amendment as you describe it. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree. I think, I've loved writing for this audience because, you have to be so clear, right? You don't dumb any ideas down or anything. You don't use jargon. You explain every logical assumption you make. And what that does to your argument is it makes it super clean. I think everybody should try to write for a 10 to 14-year-old audience sometimes when they're trying to explain complicated topics, because you realize all the stuff that you've assumed that maybe doesn't have a basis, or that you need to interrogate a bit more as you're explaining that to the audience. I also think, as you know, I love charts. And
I know that very well.
Yeah, as an aside, every memo, many memos that I turned into the judge had inexplicable charts in them. No chart needed. I would make a chart. But the chart,
I miss those.
Yeah. The charts, the graphs, all of that, I think, makes it legible to young people, to any audience. There's sidebars about, what does federalism mean? It's questions where—
Which was just, a terrific, on 31, just a terrific, quick synopsis of federalism, which goes back again to my question about adults. Everyone, it seems to me, can benefit from a clear, jargon-free description of the history of the Second Amendment. So,
I agree.
But what was there anything particularly hard about writing for 10 to 14-year-olds? Because there's a lot of history. So a 10-year-old, for example, may not appreciate some of the history that you point out, both in connection with pre-revolutionary America and England, as well as some of the Civil War and pre-Civil War history.
Yeah, and I think this was something Christian pointed out to me. Christian, edits a lot of fiction books, and something he said to me that even in nonfiction, you need characters and motivation, and that's the best way to tell the story, is if there's motivation behind the players and what they're doing, and it's the way to make things most legible. When you talk about King James and the Glorious Revolution, if you talk about it narratively and you get in the heads of Catholics in 1689 in England,
you gotta tell the audience a little bit about that.
So the Glorious Revolution is where the story starts. It is a bloodless revolution in England in the late 1600s that leads eventually to the English Bill of Rights, the sort of predecessor to the American Bill of Rights. And it was an overthrow of the Catholic king who tried to disarm the Protestant population.
King James.
King James, yes. And telling that story narratively is one way to make it more interesting. And that's something that I think I definitely learned from working with Christian.
And it is a sort of a fascinating, not overlong account of the beginning of this concern about the government trying to take people's guns away. Is that right?
Right, absolutely.
And I mean, that was somewhat surprising to me. I knew a little bit about it, but I think your elaboration was certainly gave me some things to think about. What were some of the other surprising aspects as you were researching for this book? How'd you go about researching?
So I, started with the podcast, started with some of the sources they cited in there. Adam Winkler recently wrote a great book for an adult audience about the history, and that was a great starting off point. Mm-hmm. After that, it was also a matter of diving into, Winkler focused a lot on history, but it was also a matter of diving into policy, some of the statistics, those things, and figuring out how to weave those two things together. I think I missed the first half of your question. Besides,
you're answering. So how do you? Really, the question is what was most surprising about the research, and how did you go about researching? But they're, I think, related questions.
Yeah. So I think most surprising, the biggest, most overarching surprise was just that the story of the Second Amendment is in many ways the story of America. Yeah. In order to tell the full story of guns in this country, I had to tell the full story of this country. And I mean, it starts in England, Yeah. And I think the way guns are interwoven in every period of American history was immensely surprising. I also was quite surprised by the narrative around how the NRA shifted. So for most of the NRA's history, it was not a political lobbying machine.
Yeah, what was it? What was it? This is interesting.
It started off as like a marksmanship organization. It was founded after the Civil War by two Union soldiers who were dismayed that their soldiers were not good at shooting. And it was about like riflery and practice. And over time, it grew more to be about hunting, but it was always about hunting for sport. In the 60s, they were or maybe it was the 70s, early 70s, they were planning to move to Colorado. So to pack up their headquarters in DC, move to Colorado, focus more on outdoor activities. I think somebody even suggested changing the name from the National Rifle Association to the National Outdoor Association.
You mentioned that, which is also a tidbit that I was unaware of.
Yeah, it'd be amazing. The NOA, can you believe it? But all of that was shocking to me, and the way that changed, and the sort of strange historical coincidences that brought that about, the way they involved the Black Panthers. I can get into that too.
So before, go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. So the Black Panthers in the 60s were some of the first people to bring to the forefront the individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment, the idea that the Second Amendment gives people, not people in militia, just all people, the right to bear arms. And they did so in Oakland when they were policing the police. So there was a lot of police brutality then as now. And the Black Panthers would observe arrests from a distance with loaded guns. And this practice led to
and with the exclamation that they have an individual right to bear arms, right?
Exactly. There's tons of stuff in Bobby Seale's book about how Huey Newton would always reference the Second Amendment specifically and how that gave him that right. And the retribution legislatively first came from California, who passed an act called Mulford's Act, which was supported by Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California, who obviously later changed his tune.
Yeah. But he was a big, at that point, in response, as I understand it, to the Black Panther Party, some similar organizations he was in favor of gun control.
Yes, yes. You know, as were many Republicans at the time, conservatives. And so that was, and California passed a law aimed at the Black Panthers. A few years later, there was, or maybe it was just a year later, actually, 1968, there was national legislation too, the Gun Control Act of 1968. And that shift, like this rise in legislation, leads to a lot of fear among the more gun rights supporters in the NRA, the people who are like the hardliners is what they're called. And eventually they rise up against the organization's leaders, the people who supported the idea.
The NOA.
Yeah, the NOA, and overtake the organization. That happens in 1977 at this annual meeting in Cincinnati. It's known as the Revolt at Cincinnati. And that's the birth of today's NRA, essentially. Yeah.
But you know, what's fascinating about the way that you tell the story, Hana, what I loved about the way that you tell the story is that you said that guns map on to American history, and they're really two sort of inseparable issues and stories. But you also, I think, make a compelling case, but correct me if you think I'm wrong, that guns map onto the racial history of this country as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? You actually, obviously, you alluded to that by reference to the Black Panther Party, but this goes way back. Is that right?
It starts at the beginning. I mean, you know, some of the earliest gun laws are meant at disarming Indigenous and Black people. And the KKK is founded as a disarmament organization. Its intent.
What is it, meaning what?
It's the KKK's intent was to disarm Black people who had formerly been enslaved, like as a means of maintaining subjugation. And then you see, you know, laws like parts of the Black codes that are meant at disarming Black people. It's throughout history, and like you said, guns are the story of America. Guns are also the story of race.
Right. And you mentioned some of the slave revolts where it was really about trying to take guns away, but also using the superior firepower, frankly, of white militias,
right,
to subdue insurrections.
Right. Guns are power in this narrative.
Yeah. So, and you were going to talk a little bit about the NRA. Look, as you point out, both just now and also in your book, the NRA, maybe a little less so this year, ironically, but the NRA has become an extraordinarily powerful lobbying group, sort of a public policy group. How in the world did that happen?
So there's a book by David Cole, the legal director at the ACLU.
Yep.
And he devotes a third of it to sort of understanding how the NRA shaped constitutional understandings in DC v. Heller. And there are other scholars too who try to analyze what makes the NRA so powerful and so effective. And there's a lot of factors. Obviously, there's money, there's number of members, but the conclusion they come to pretty uniformly is that, you know, there are probably just as many people who support gun control as, you know, who support gun rights. What's the difference? And they say the gap is not so much in like feeling or intensity, but in action. And that the NRA's biggest tool is what they call the hassle factor, what scholars call the hassle factor, which is just, you know, members writing letters to Congress people, or picketing, or the NRA putting up billboards in your district that, if you're a Republican, that compare you to Barack Obama and like lose you an election, which is something that happened to a representative named Deborah Maggart, I think out of Tennessee.
Right. And what happened to her? You actually did. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, so she tabled a bill that was supported by the NRA. She didn't even vote against it. I think she tabled it. And in response, the NRA put billboards up in her district that had a picture of her and Barack Obama, who was president at the time, captioned, "Defend freedom, defeat MAGGART." And she lost her primary by many, many percentage points. And the idea is to make examples out of politicians who step out of line. It's also to sort of create a lot of political noise. Politicians are risk averse. And so the idea of losing their seat because of not supporting the NRA becomes like the factor that gives the NRA its power. But what I think is sort of positive and democratic about the hassle factor is that it's achievable. It is not corruption per se, it's just like writing a lot of letters, making a lot of calls. And I think another interesting distinction between gun rights organizations and gun control organizations is that there are added benefits to being in a gun rights organization, like camaraderie. You get sort of a fun gift when you join. There's magazines. And so people are more likely to join those organizations because there are these fun secondary community benefits, which don't exist in many gun control organizations. That's another takeaway that I think is achievable.
Well, what would those fun things be? I mean, and part of the problem is that, many of the gun control advocates, correct me again if you think I'm wrong about this, are aggrieved and deeply upset, particularly about the mass shootings on school premises, in churches, and in other places. So what are the fun things that come out of that?
Maybe fun things is the wrong term. I think I meant I think I just meant that it's, the way that gun rights organizations often can create community. It's important for gun control. Do you
think that that's changed? And you talk a little bit about this in the aftermath of all of these mass shootings, in particular Parkland. I mean, you start with Parkland in 2018. That seems to have sparked a real response that's on a level with the concerns expressed by the NRA.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite cool too because it's a youth movement, and young people are organizing. It's both the kids from Parkland. It's also a group out of Chicago called the Peace Warriors who are gaining more national attention now. And I think you're right that it feels like those things are changing. These young people who, some can vote in this coming election, many cannot, are still able to do grassroots organizing in that way.
And you devote a chapter to Heller. Can you talk, and I know that there are some number of lawyers on this, but can you talk a little bit about Heller and how that's changed the landscape a little bit?
Sure. So District of Columbia versus Heller was a 2008 case, which was the case that cemented our current understanding of the Second Amendment as an individual right. This case sort of brought to the Supreme Court the question of whether the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, was a militia right or an individual right. And in this case, the plaintiff, Dick Heller, challenged a District of Columbia law banning handguns. And in the end, I can get into the details, but I think the outcome is that he wins, and Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia, declares that the Second Amendment original meaning had been lost. It was an individual right.
Right.
However,
he puts the stamp of approval on the Black Panther Party.
I don't think he thought he was doing that, but however, he does include a paragraph that says, like all other right, it's not absolute. There are certain people who might not have the right to bear arms. There are certain locations where you can ban guns, like schools. And some people think that paragraph, like expressly saying that it wasn't an absolute right, was the price for a fifth vote from Justice Kennedy, who was the swing justice at that time. But What's happened in the wake of DC v. Heller is that the gun rights organizations have an additional tool in their belt, which is constitutional legitimacy.
Yep.
And they can use that, and you see it constantly in tweets. I searched on Twitter Second Amendment the other day, and most of the top tweets are Donald Trump endorsing local level candidates for their support of the Second Amendment. And you see, tons of politicians voicing that. And it's, this Constitution is like hallowed ground. And so if you can ground your argument in the Constitution, it gives it legitimacy. So that is one of the outcomes. The other outcome is that even though that's sort of been in the popular sphere, a lot of gun laws have been upheld because of that paragraph that Justice Scalia included. That said, the fact that, litigation can happen does chill or sort of stop states from passing laws in the first place because they're afraid of being sued because litigation is expensive.
Let me just ask you one other area that I found fascinating. Well, all of the chapters actually had little nuggets that I was just not aware of. And I read Michael Waldman's book, and so that's pretty good. That you were able to find things maybe I'm a 10 to 14-year-old, I don't know, but that you're able to find facts and also present them in ways that really made me, and hopefully everyone who reads the book, think and wonder. But the international comparison was fascinating. And I've always known that we are, as a country, we have vastly more guns, certainly compared to the UK, for example, even among law enforcement officers. But you make a really compelling case. So can you talk a little bit about that and why is it important for kids to know about that? Kids in the US and kids around the world.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a chapter towards the end that does sort of a comparison between the US and other countries, their gun laws and their gun death rates. And as you might expect, other countries have stricter gun laws and way, way, way fewer deaths. And the reason
is that because of an absence of a constitutional support for guns, or why is that?
So, I mean, arguably, we also didn't have a constitutional support for guns until 2008.
Right.
But other countries reacted differently. In the UK, after a massacre in Dunblane, Scotland, they immediately passed much stricter gun laws. And I think, putting aside constitutional stuff, there's an argument that there's more cultural attachment or something. But the reason that cultural attachment in the US, I think the reason it's important to include these comparative numbers is just because when you live in the US, it's hard to imagine anything else. Mm-hmm. You sort of take for granted that there's just going to be a lot of guns and there's going to be a lot of gun death and that's how it's going to happen. But that doesn't have to be the case. And I think another really, really interesting statistic that's in the book is that the US isn't, among comparable countries, the US isn't really an outlier in terms of crime rates, but it is an outlier in terms of like deaths associated with crime. And so the takeaway is that while gun laws might not prevent crimes from happening, they do prevent deadlier crimes from happening, which I think is very interesting.
So you mentioned, you used the word takeaway, and as we've discussed, this book is primarily designed for 10 to 14-year-olds, although I continue to insist that it's actually designed for everybody. What do you hope, at least young readers, take away from this, from reading this book?
Yeah, I want them to take away all the things that I thought were surprising, that it's the story of America, that there are some strange historical coincidences that you can trace the Black Panther Party to the NRA to our modern conception of guns. I want them to take away how new our individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment is. And I also want them, and I hope you got this from the book, but my intent was to present the facts, to present the history, to lay it out. And I do come to some conclusions, but I also wanted to allow the reader to come to their own conclusions. And I wanted them to have all the facts and history to let them get there. And so I work with, or I volunteer with this organization called Legal Outreach.
Great organization. I'll give it a plug too.
They're amazing. So part of it is it's high school students in New York, and they're paired with lawyers throughout the city. And part of the program are these constitutional law debates, which is unbelievably impressive. They're like 14 and doing stuff I couldn't.
Love to hear it. Love to hear that.
Yeah, it's amazing. And one of the debates was on the Second Amendment. And so I talked to my mentee, and, we judged several students as they debated what was a really nuanced prompt. I went back to look at it actually earlier. So the prompt was a college student who is being stalked by her ex-boyfriend wants to keep a gun in her dorm room. And she's arrested for doing so. And then she challenges the law under the Second Amendment. And that was sort of the debate they had. And what I thought was so cool about that, and what I hope to present in the book too, is that there's nuance. I think all of us, kids included, hear stuff from the news or their parents, but there's a lot there. And I wanted them to be able to have all of those facts, all of that evidence, and come to conclusions on their own.
Well, and what are these kids saying? I'm interested because, I've got two sons. And if you recall, in New York, the public school students and private school students on one day marched in protest. So they left their classrooms. I had one son who led a major protest in Manhattan, and I had another son who stayed in the classroom. So people have got very different views for different reasons, but I'm interested in knowing, to the extent that you spoke to the kids, for example, as part of Legal Outreach, or any other kids in connection with researching this book, where are we? Where are they?
Yeah, I think they recognize that the right should not be unlimited, and that while this case presented to them is complicated and nuanced and raises a lot of other issues, that doesn't necessarily mean guns for all. And I think that presenting them with all that context helps them come to those conclusions.
So what about those kids who, and there are a significant number of kids, I'm sure, whose parents may have a different view? What's the utility of this book for them?
It gives them all the evidence, it gives them the facts, it gives them the history, it lets them argue the issue with their parents, or talk to their parents about it. Yeah. Absolutely.
And where do you think we're heading, Hana? Where are we going on this issue that, as you've described it, maps our history? So, if it maps our history, tell me where we're going with guns, and maybe I'll have a sense of where we're going in other ways as a country.
Thank you for asking me to predict the future.
That's your job.
Yeah, right. I just think we're headed towards deepening polarization. If we're not polarized enough already, it's what happened after DC v. Heller. The fact of constitutional legitimacy, pushed the left to the left and the right to the right in the gun control debate before DC v. Heller. Some Republicans supported gun reforms after fewer did. And so I think...
And is that because, in part, the Supreme Court took the policy debate off the table?
Yeah, I think so. I think also just sort of giving the right constitutional legitimacy does that. I think the change is probably at the state level, looking forward. And that's another cool thing about learning the NRA's history, is you learn how they did what they did, and they did it all at the state level. or most of it at the state level before they got to the Supreme Court. And so I think that's probably where the movement is in the future.
Right. Well, you know, I'm not even sure that I can, as a federal judge, make a plug for a book. But I will say, buy this book. So this is just terrific. I'm, again, thrilled and so proud of you, Hana, for this terrific accomplishment. And hopefully everybody picks it up.
Thank you for doing the Q&A with me.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great discussion. So now we are moving into the point of the Q&A. And so how we're going to run it to everyone out there is you can type in your questions to the Q&A at the bottom, and then I will go through and I will read them for Hana. So get away at typing. Well, we got a comment. Someone wants to know what they should read next after reading your book.
I would encourage them. I'm going to make a plug for Macmillan.
Do it. Love Macmillan.
I would encourage them to check out the Macmillan website. I think there's a lot of other great books, a lot of which I read actually in preparation for, like, that I read in order to understand the right tone and voice. I remember the fault lines in our Constitution being great. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting the one about the march. It's about Meredith's March, but the title is not Meredith's March. Anyway, Wendy, if you know it, do chat me. But that book was great too.
All right, up next we have, if you had to point to a fact in the book as pivotal to the state of gun laws today, what would it be?
I think it was the 1977 revolt at Cincinnati in the NRA. That's when, you know, the hardliners took over the NRA's leadership and changed the organization's, changed the organization's future. They, you know, shortly after that revolt, the second half of the Second Amendment, just the bit about the right of the people to keep and bear arms, was installed on the wall in NRA headquarters. You know, Second Amendment hadn't been part of their lobbying, even though they had done some lobbying in the past. You know, it wasn't like a clean break, but it was, you know, the Second Amendment became the key to that. And then for the next, you know, 40 years, from 77 to 2008, they waged a very effective campaign to transform constitutional meaning under, you know, what was decided as like an originalist view. There's actually some very interesting responses to Justice Scalia's opinion, both from conservatives and liberals, saying this is not originalism. This was not originalism at all.
Okay, nice. Let's see, up next we have, did you have any particular sources you enjoyed and anything readers should check out for themselves?
There's a great book by Charles Cobb called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, and it's about guns in the civil rights movement and the role of guns in protecting protesters from either counter-protesters or even the police. And I think the integral role of guns in the civil rights movement was super, super interesting to me. So I would recommend it.
Although not well known. Not well known.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Up next, we have a question from Anna Joseph. She asked, did you test the writing with real young adults, and how did you figure out how to moderate the language for their level?
So that's where Christian and Mark and Wendy were so helpful. They have tons and tons of experience with this, and helped me moderate. They also sent the book to a teacher. I sent this book to my friend Hana Bajramovic, who is here, who is a teacher, who teaches this age level, and all of that helped me.
Up next, we have a question from Suzanne. She said, in Heller, did Scalia attempt to square his view that the Second Amendment is an individual right with his general originalist jurisprudential philosophy?
That's Susan, my coworker. Thank you, Susan, for the deeply legal question. Yeah, that was the idea that the Second Amendment's like original meaning had been lost, but this was what it meant at the outset. Both Scalia and the dissenters used originalism. Also, both parties arguing used originalism. I think honestly, this case is a great example of how originalism is deeply malleable, and how it originalism for everyone is like the idea that you should interpret the Constitution the way the founders would have interpreted it. But it's very hard to get in their heads. They are not here to tell us. And so it as a legal philosophy, like, has a lot of limitations.
But your view, Hana, is that this idea of an individual right to bear arms would have been foreign to most people at the founding.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the book also goes into great detail about the immense number of gun laws that have existed since the founding. There's a sidebar about the Wild West that I love. The Wild West, which we think of as like shooting, free-for-alls, had so many gun laws. My favorite gun law was when you came to a Wild West town, you had to go to the police station and check in your gun for a token, like a coat check, and then you could get the gun back again when you left. It's wild.
The Wild West. I don't know if it's a whole little 2 pages or 3 pages there. It's great.
Let's see. All right, we have from Dahlia a bit of a comment at first. So what a wonderful discussion / book talk. So what was the toughest concept to distill / phrase in a way that was accessible for the 10 to 14-year-olds? And I know you touched a bit on this in terms of things you found interesting and surprising, but was wondering if there was something specific that was hard to kind of distill down.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind was talking about why liberals, it was in the Heller chapter. And I had like a sentence in there that said, at the time the court had 4 liberal justices, 4 conservative justices, and 1 swing justice, Justice Kennedy. And I had a sentence that said, the liberals were likely to support the militia right interpretation, and the conservatives were likely to support the individual rights interpretation. And I don't know if it was Christian or maybe Wendy said, you need to like break that into like 300 pieces. First of all, how are judges conservative or liberal?
Right.
Second of all, why might a liberal like the individual rights interpretation? And then I said, or liberal like the militia right interpretation. And I said, because, liberals who more often support gun control. And they were like, hold up. Why do liberals like gun control? And there was just a whole bunch of sort of steps that needed to be gone through in order to make that one sentence understandable. And that ties back to what it means to write for a 10 to 14-year-old audience. I think, I might write that sentence to people, I work with or talk to, and it would make sense. But when you do it for a younger audience, you have to explain it all, and then you have to understand why all those things are true. And it's not actually super easy to prove why those things are true.
Definitely. Let's see. Up next, we have, for those who are interested in gun reform, do you think more can be accomplished in the courts or in the legislatures?
I think legislatures. I mean, I think the NRA in the 40 years between the revolution and, I mean, the NRA revolution, not the American Revolution, the NRA revolution and 2008 did a lot of work on state constitutions such that they now often explicitly protect an individual right to bear arms. And so I think the potential for, while courts can be a place to sort of prevent, like they're often on the defensive, like when you're in litigation, I think the legislative realm is where you can make more change.
Let's see, we have, with the NRA having continued legal and financial issues, do you feel that will help gun control activists, or is gun control too ingrained in society where it will take time for change?
I mean, I think that, yeah, that's also really interesting. The New York AG recently sued the NRA too. I don't know if y'all have been following this, but it's very interesting. Arguing that they misappropriated their funds given their tax status, and like one of the remedies that the New York AG seeks first is the ousting of several top leaders who she argues misappropriated funds, and also dissolution of the NRA. To the extent that this lawsuit is, it succeeds, I think probably the more likely outcome is ousting and not dissolution, because I think to prove to get dissolution, you have to prove that the fraud sort of permeated the whole organization. Anyway, that's a very interesting lawsuit. I think it's you rarely see the NRA on the defense like this. But to get back to your point, to get back to your question, sorry, about whether like the NRA's dissolution actually will have an effect. I think it does, because I think, the organization of a lot of people with a lot of viewpoints is how change is affected. There are tons and tons of gun control advocates who are very fervently passionate around the country, but there's not necessarily, I mean, a lot of them are gaining in power, but there isn't necessarily an NRA correlate. And I think it's that organization that helps produce a lot of change.
The heckling factor.
Yeah, the hassle factor, but also
the hassle factor.
Here we go. Let's see, we have, do you think the recent discussion of militias in the national media might have any impact on perception/developments on gun laws? And are there any analogies that we can draw with the Panthers?
Yeah, I mean, the militia stuff is super fascinating. I was thinking about that because I was like, if we had a militia interpretation, would it only apply to them? Which is odd. I do think it's interesting. I think now that we have the individual right, I think the militia factor sort of dissipates. But it is, I mean, obviously the parallels to the Black Panthers are interesting. Yeah.
Right. From Nora, we have, you're an author and a lawyer. Were there things that were surprisingly similar or excitingly different about the two kinds of work? You mentioned, for example, the ways that writing for this age group made you clarify your arguments, and has that impacted how you do any of your legal work?
Yeah, actually, I think it has. I think it was always clear to me, it's always been important to like write clearly. But I think that feels like doubly true now. And sort of the importance of subheadings and, cleanly defining the subparts of your argument. Like, I think all that, Lohier is applauding because he also does. But I think, yeah, it emphasizes the importance of that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. From David, we have, I can't wait to give this book to my nephews. Do you have any tips for talking to their parents about why a book that discusses guns is appropriate for young readers?
Yeah, I think that, and that's been, a lot of people have responded initially by being like, is this appropriate for 10 to 14-year-olds? But it absolutely is. Like, they face this problem every day. That story I told earlier about the pellet guns being shot at teachers who were left with welts, that's in an elementary school. Very young kids are exposed to this stuff, so I don't think there's any like exposure issue. I think if anything, it might make them feel less afraid because they feel like they have the tools to deal with the problem.
Yeah. All right, so we're wrapping. We got like about 5 minutes left, so I'll have some wrap-up questions. One, we have, what made you want to write this book?
I think it was a combination of being so interested in and surprised by when I initially learned the history via that podcast, and realizing that a book like this didn't exist for this age group. Indeed, as the judge has repeated, a book like this doesn't exactly exist for the adult age group either. Things are like more in depth, or they're more separated. It's all in one. It's the full history. It's got the policy. It's all there, and it's very digestible.
Cool. All right, we just had another question pop in, so this is kind of going back from the wrap-up questions, but it was a good one. So how do you think efforts to change the actions of corporations, either by limiting selling guns to consumers or by changing laws on liability for gun manufacturers, ties in reform efforts and the Second Amendment debate?
Yeah, so the liability question is a very good one. It's another one of the state level reforms that the NRA pushed for throughout, I think, the 80s and 90s. They strove to ensure that gun manufacturers could only be liable for when a gun misfired, not from criminal misuse of their products. Because there were a lot, I think it was, they were trying to replicate, many people were trying to replicate the litigation that had been successful against cigarette companies by similarly suing gun manufacturers for when people were shot. And the NRA pushed for immunity for gun manufacturers, and they did so successfully at the state and at the federal level. So then in 2005, they passed a federal law that immunized gun manufacturers in the same way. There are certain states that do not have such immunity laws, and there is indeed a case in Connecticut that I am avidly watching, where after the Sandy Hook massacre, parents sued, I believe, Remington, under a theory that they marketed their guns inappropriately such that a mass shooting eventually occurred under a Connecticut state law in Connecticut state court. And recently the Connecticut State Supreme Court, I believe, held that this suit was okay, even because even though there was that federal immunity law, because the federal immunity law was not intended to preclude state laws that allowed you to sue. And I think the United States Supreme Court recently denied cert on that. So that case is going to trial. And it's interesting. It's an interesting potential future avenue.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so we have about 5 variations of this question. So do you have any plans to write any future books? And what can you tell us about your future writing career?
What's next? What's next?
Yeah, there's another one coming out. It'll be similar to this one, but it'll be about the 14th Amendment. So keep it in mind.
No, for the same target readership. That's great.
Yeah,
amazing.
That's a pretty big topic.
Yeah. I mean, I thought the Second Amendment was big, but I think the 14th Amendment would be bigger.
Just gonna go on, knock out all the amendments.
Well, I've joked often that I want to write one about the third because it's housing and quartering soldiers, and there's like nothing about it.
The amendment that will never.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for both of you for joining us tonight. I think this was a really great discussion, and I hope all of our audience members out there learned a lot from today and your book in general. I want to remind everyone that you can purchase Hana's book on our website at powerhousebookstores.com. So show your love and support, both to Hana and to the local bookstore. So yeah, do you guys have any wrap-up comments or anything?
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Christian and Mark and Wendy, my parents, my sister, and to Judge Lohier, who has supported me throughout this whole book writing process, from the beginning. So, thank you.
And I just want to say I'm thrilled and very proud, and it's a terrific book. So everybody should read it. I don't care if you're 10 or 70, you should read this book. Thank you very much, Brittany.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.